Test, test, test. Check, check. 1, 2. Ready? Good.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sarah Yerkes. I'm a fellow here at Carnegie. First of all, let me get this book to show you all, because this is the reason we're all here today. First of all, I just want to congratulate my two colleagues, Fred and Anwar, for this fabulous book that we'll be discussing today. It really was a great read, and I think it offered a lot of both some sort of cross-regional issues that we'll talk about, I'm sure, but some very specific, nuanced explanations of what actually is occurring in this realm in each of the different states. So let me introduce our two authors here. We have, to my left, Fred Wary, who is a senior fellow in the Middle East program here at Carnegie, and Anwar Bukhars, who is a non-resident senior fellow in the Middle East program at Carnegie as well. And they are going to first start off with giving you a little bit of an explanation of their findings in the book, and then we are also joined by two distinguished guests who will be offering some of their thoughts on the book's findings, as well as this issue generally of Salafism in the Maghreb. So I'll first turn it over to Fred.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming today, given what's happening in our world elsewhere. We're delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the Maghreb, an area that's of interest to all of us, and specifically a dimension of Islam that is often understudied. What I'd like to do is give you a sense of the purpose of our research, some general findings about Salafism across the region, and then two of the country cases that I focused on, Mauritania and Libya. I think we can all agree that the Maghreb has long been understudied. Of course, since 2011, that's changed, and we've seen this obviously with Tunisia being the birthplace of the Arab Spring. As sort of a typology for understanding the Middle East, the Maghreb encompasses a broad spectrum of regime types, different dimensions of stability, ranging again from quasi-democracy, democracy, monarchy, entrenched military-run autocracy, complete failure. There are states that are fabulously rich with hydrocarbons and desperately poor. And I think Islam and Islamism is obviously part of this spectrum. And I think one of our assumptions going into this study is that the locus, or the sort of focal point for energy in Islam and Islamism in the Middle East, is also shifting to the Maghreb in many respects, in the way that Islamists are debating politics, the way they're participating in conflicts, the way that I think they're really innovating new ideas. And so we don't approach the Maghreb as simply an adjunct of the Gulf. And obviously that's a common misperception in the media and popular imagination, that somehow Islam, and especially Salafism, is simply a projection of Gulf and Saudi influence onto this region. The Maghreb is an exemplar for Islam and Islamism in both good and bad ways. Obviously, the Tunisian democratic experiment is a good thing, I think, in terms of the participation of political Islamists, but also a bad one in terms of the preponderance of jihadists that have gone abroad, and also Libya, where the Islamic State set up its strongest affiliate outside of Syria and Iraq. Again, going back to Salafism, how did it start? This notion that somehow this region is simply a sort of passive receptacle for Saudi influence. We discussed this at length in the introduction, and it's patently false. The Maghreb obviously has a rich tradition of Islam. It participated in some of the reformist currents of Salafism that started in the late 19th and early 20th century. They had contact with the Gulf well before the injection of petrodollars. So this notion that somehow Salafism in the Maghreb spread because of the petrodollar injection is false as well. And again, what we argue is when you're looking at these movements, these currents, think about localism. Localization has been at work. We've seen this in terms of how they negotiate clerical authority. The notion that somehow local clerics receive guidance from Saudi Arabia and simply act upon it is patently false. We go through that in a number of instances. There's a great deal of pushback, negotiation. There's blatant criticism, as we'll talk about in the case of Algeria. The influence is often bidirectional. We've seen in Mauritania clerics that are actually in very high positions in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So we're approaching Salafism as a rich social, political, and intellectual, and yes, sometimes military force in these countries. It's certainly worthy of study in its own right, but it's also a window. It's a window into this region's changing state, society, dynamics, into the grievances and aspirations of its increasingly youthful population. What does this movement tell us about the health of regimes? What does it tell us about the propensity for future radicalization or instability? Why are people joining it? Certainly there's that push factor. There is money coming in. There's obviously this injection of Saudi money, in fact, did make a difference in the 70s and 80s in terms of the institutes that were set up. But that's only part of the story. We have to look at the changing fortunes of other variations of Islam, Islamic parties, Islamic movements. We also have to look with regime policies in terms of supporting some of these Salafi movements. And there's also a psychological and sociological dimension to this. And we'll get into what is Salafism in just a bit. But this notion of Salafism as a moral utopia, right? The triumphalism, the saved sect. It looks to an idealized past. It has a critique of corruption, of a polluted moral order. I think that can be very appealing in times of distress, dislocation, whether that's dislocation that arose from the disappointments of the Arab Spring or globalization or state collapse in the case of Libya. So Salafism, by its nature, challenges hierarchies, whether they're tribal, sometimes even class. This notion, at least in theory, it's deterritorialized, right? It's transnational. It creates this imagined community. Of course, what we argue throughout our case is that in practice, Salafism molds itself to local context. It's actually quite localized, and it also absorbs other traditions. You know, what is Salafism? Again, we can go into our definition of it. We do have a sort of primer. We have 7 features. We go into the intellectual genealogy of this movement, going back to Ibn Taymiyyah, Hanbali, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the reformist variant, and we really try to inject some nuance into the term Salafism. But I think it's important to realize that there's no hard definition. There's a sort of loose consensus, and even among Salafis in these country cases, there is sometimes some shape-shifting. They will sometimes not necessarily call themselves Salafis. There's some accommodation with other sects, and I think this is an important feature because it speaks to the flexibility. We do go into different types of Salafis, and there's a very famous tripartite typology that you're probably all familiar with that arose in the 2000s by a very noted scholar of this movement, quietists, politicos, and jihadists. And it really speaks to the way that they approach politics and also violence. It's in some sense a flawed division, but what we did is we sort of canvassed the other typologies and we didn't find anything better. So this is a very useful typology for approaching Salafism. Very briefly, what does it mean? The quietists, as the term implies, means they avoid active political participation. They avoid armed conflict. They're typically seen as being loyalists to an established political authority. And this particular current arose in Saudi Arabia in the 1990s as a result of more activist, brotherhood-inspired Saudi currents. But as we get into, they're not necessarily apolitical, right? Quietists, if you support a sitting political ruler, that means you're political. You're taking a political stance. And quietist does not mean that you're nonviolent. We're seeing these so-called quietists in Libya that are actually fighting. They're taking part in the armed conflict. Politico-Salafis, these are the ones that participate in politics. And this is a huge step for them, given that in terms of much of Salafi doctrine, it's considered heretical to participate in forms of party activism, Hezbollah. But we've seen Salafi parties, Hezbollah Noor. We've seen other Salafi parties in the Maghreb take their inspiration from Salafi parties in Kuwait. So there is Salafi political activism, provided there's that democratic election context. And then the jihadists. I think this is the one that most people are familiar with. But we're saying is Salafism does not equal jihadism. The jihadists borrow from certain Salafi ideology, but they also incorporate kutub. We can talk about the relationship between Salafi ideology and the propensity for violence, and it's not direct, right? This is a huge debate that's broader than just the Maghreb, but does Salafism, enable one to commit acts of violence? Our definition of it, our conclusion is Salafi education certainly socializes you to certain concepts that are illiberal and could potentially be used for violence, but the decision to commit violence is a whole range of different factors, many of which are rooted in very worldly concerns like corruption, foreign occupation, peer pressure, et cetera. And there's a whole literature on that. I'm going to just very briefly talk about two of the country cases that I researched and their significance really for the broader Salafi movement or current in the Maghreb and also Maghreb stability. Mauritania is a very interesting country, often off the radar, I think. What's fascinating about this country, small population, desperately poor, but has an incredibly rich Islamic heritage in terms of its intellectual heritage. It's very unique Islamic institutions called the Mahtara, which are seminaries where students from around the Islamic world come to study. Has a very rich Sufi tradition. And what this has done, I think, is sort of tempered or moderated the arrival of Salafism. So Salafis are present in Mauritania, but they've got to coexist with this very rich Islamic environment that dates back centuries, and it's resulted in something of an ambiguity of Salafism, right? These Salafis often don't act Salafi. Some people talk about post-Salafism in Mauritania. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Again, why did Salafism arise in this country? There was a wave of urbanization in the 70s, that sense of dislocation. It was marked by the injection of funds from Saudi Arabia, so that did, in fact, play a part. There was a brief democratic opening in this country where Islamists did, in fact, participate in elections and politics, but it was quickly crushed. There was imprisonment of Islamist clerics marked by massive corruption. On top of this, the country is racially stratified. So again, this is a recipe for radicalization. And to be sure, Mauritanian jihadists played a very significant role in al-Qaeda, often as jurists and ideologues. They went to Afghanistan. And from 2005 to 2011, the country faced a very real jihadist threat in terms of the number of attacks on security forces. This was also inspired and the result of what was happening in Algeria and also Mali. But the country defeated that. And this is often held up as sort of a model for approaching jihadism, but also Salafism. They defeated this threat through a combination of pure force, right? Military measures, judicial measures, the threat of judicial punishment, imprisonment, but also ideological reformism, countering violent extremism. And here, the Mauritanians hold this up as a model. There was some efficacy. They mobilized Salafi clerics against these jihadists. Many of them have been released, but they're closely watched. Meanwhile, the most radical Salafis are allowed certain space to preach, even on very abrasive topics and controversial topics, provided they don't cross certain red lines. And so the Mauritanian government's sort of holding this up as a CVE model. How do you engage Salafis? As we'll get into in the discussion, I think this is a flawed assumption. Many of the drivers of radicalization are still present in Mauritania, to include a real military autocracy and massive corruption. So how long can this balancing act last? On Libya, the important thing here is the rise of a particular current of Salafism known as Markhalism, which is a quietist variant of Salafism that arose in the latter years really of Gaddafi's rule, where he actually supported this movement as a counterweight to jihadism and the Muslim Brotherhood. This movement really exploded after the revolution. You have Markhalis that are actively involved in the armed conflict now between Haftar and the GNA. They're battling for social space. They're attacking Sufi shrines. They're going after more activist clerics. They're enforcing their own draconian moral norms in terms of mixing of genders. But I've done a lot of field work among these Markhalis in various locations, and I think the bottom line, we can get into this in the discussion, they're not unified, right, as a monolithic block across the country, right? So a Markhali in the eastern part has to adapt himself to the local context there, the political context, the social context, the tribal context. And a Markhali in the west, in Sabrata, for instance, is also sort of limited by his town's orientation. So this notion that the Markhalis are acting as a unified political force or a Trojan horse is simply not borne out by reality. But they are a major social force. They're drawing a lot of concern from liberals, from opposing Islamists. There's a question in the international community, what should we do about Madkhalism? They're also presenting themselves as counter-terrorists. They were the ones that fought the Islamic State in Sirte. They're going after them in Tripoli as well. They're running their own re-indoctrination programs in prisons. But again, just to conclude, Madkhalism is a force. Why is it growing, right? We have to ask ourselves, what are the drivers for increased social conservatism in Libya today? Why are more young people joining this movement? Certainly there's Saudi money coming in, but it also reflects that sort of psychological shift that I talked about, right? Libya is in such a state of dislocation. People are gravitated to Salafism from some deeper reason, and it's going to be here to stay. The question of addressing their use of armed force is simply fixing Libya's political problems, the broader challenge of that, creating a unified army and police, and dealing with their use of armed force in that way. So,
okay, I'll talk briefly on 3 chapters: Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. And throughout these chapters, we try to address the complex and thorny relationship between and among the different Salafi factions, and how during critical juncture they have positioned themselves vis-a-vis each other and then vis-a-vis the regimes in place. So let's look at the Algerian chapter. In the Algerian chapter, we try to examine how Salafism has evolved over time with a particular focus on the ideological fractionalization and factionalism. And special attention is given to the quietist current, because that's the one that is most dominant. In Algeria, the political and the jihadi variant of Salafism, remains a contentious fringe. But the weakening of these two strands, especially in the 2000s and beyond, stands in sharp contrast with the gradual surge of quietist Salafists. Quietist Salafists who abstain from formal politics, who reject violence, and who advocate the spread and application of their strictly conservative theological orientation in society. So this evolving influence and the growing strength of quietist Salafists in Algeria does not mean that this movement is harmonious, right? Or it's even cooperative. In fact, quietist Salafists, they have to grapple with leadership disputes. They have among themselves. They have to grapple, over disagreements, over agendas and strategies to pursue. There are similar tensions within quietist Salafists today in Algeria between followers of Sheikh Mohammed bin Hadi al-Madkhali, and then there are those that subscribe to the teachings of, Rabi' bin Hadi al-Madkhali. And these tensions between these two camps within quietist Salafism, they have evolved into a full-fledged public dispute between these two camps. Nonetheless, quietist Salafis, they continue to expand their influence within Algeria. In the post-2011 era, the Algerian regime has struggled how to deal with quietist Salafis, how to develop a coherent strategy to contain their gradual expansion in Algerian society. On the one hand, there are those within the Algerian regime that have been warning about, Salafism, quietist Salafis, their rigid teachings, the insubordination of some Salafi clerics. On the other hand, there are factions within the regimes that continue to see quietist Salafis as a useful tool to deploy against political, Salafis, against jihadists, against the regional, tribal, and sectarian threats that Algeria faces today. But whatever the truth about the regime's stance towards quietist Salafism, the reality is that there is a steady expansion of quietist Salafism in Algeria. And why? Why is it expanding? Well, that's a manifestation of the crisis of state institutions in the country. an appreciable number of Algerians today cannot find inspiration or self-confidence in the traditional institutions of religion. You know, the neighborhood imams who once played an important role in shaping and molding the worldviews of ordinary Algerians, you know, have lost steam. They have been increasingly contested by these quietist Salafi preachers. The popular appeal of Sufism has also weakened in Algeria. Mainstream Islamists do not fare any better. And like in Tunisia and in Morocco, where Islamist parties have matured into important intellectual and political forces, Algerian Islamist political forces today have sunk into intellectual lethargy. The Islamist parties in Algeria are largely disconnected from their electoral constituencies. So this inability to adjust to major social transformations within the country has eroded, their social and political standing in society. And that has left, room for quietist Salafists to expand and to grow in influence. Morocco is also an interesting case. Salafism in Morocco has been a dynamic movement, since before, obviously, colonialism. I'm not going to go into the history, right? But for a part of the chapter, special attention, again, is given to the quietist current, because that's the most dominant in the country, more so than the jihadist current. The quietist current has for decades prohibited political activism before succumbing to the pressure of local and regional events. Two events had an impact on quietist Salafism in Morocco. First is the May 2003 terrorist attack in Casablanca, and two, the birth of the February 20th movement, pro-democracy movement, in 2011. And these two major events in the country, they shook the quietist current to its core. It raised fundamental questions about, the adaptability of the activities of quietist Salafists, the methods of their activism. The Arab uprisings of 2011 and its subsequent derailment in Syria, but particularly Egypt, with the coup in Egypt, it expedited the debates and fault lines within the quietist current, and also, some former jihadists, Salafists within Morocco, ultimately leading to the fracturing of this movement, quietist Salafists, into two camps. So in the chapter, I illustrate this rift within quietist Salafism. It's not a monolithic movement, by tracing, the course of two of its most prominent figures and the critical stages that have influenced their ideological postures, their relations with the ruling regime, and the adaptability to local and regional changes. There is this guy, and we don't need to go into the details. I can address them if you're interested. Muhammad al-Maghrawi, very influential. He's the most dominant and influential figure of quietist Salafism. And then there is the second figure, Hamad al-Qabbaj, who gained visibility as his deputy. But they broke up after the coup in Egypt in 2003. But again, what's interesting about the Moroccan case is the rise of this reformist current within quietist Salafists, with Qabbaj at its head, that provides the intellectual and religious backbone for this hesitant movement of quietist Salafism towards a mix of Salafi dawah, proselytizing, with political activism. And again, what's interesting about Morocco, about this particular current, is its efforts, to try to reconcile Salafism with democracy. And I think that's the major finding, here, or something to pursue. I don't know how successful, that movement towards some kind of democracy will be. Qabbaj has said that, look, democracy, yes, it's a flawed system, right? But nonetheless, he said that democracy is the best thing out there because it represents, the Islamic principles of what he said: good governance, fairness, accountability. That the pious predecessors, Salaf, Salih, and the rightly guided Khalifs have enjoined. So again, it's too early to tell how successful, this Qabbaj and his current will be. The current draws its strength from a group of educated and middle-class youth, Moroccan youths, who believe that their mission might be better accomplished by participating in politics. And they believe that if Morocco democratizes further, then that would redound to their benefits. Finally, Tunisia. Tunisia is a fascinating case, obviously, in several regards, right? It provides fresh insights into, first, Islamism and secularism, and their competing claims to, concepts of freedom and justice. The Tunisian case also provides a unique context in which deep divisions among political Islamists themselves over the nature of and rules of religious activism and mobilization played in the new Tunisia. Among the thorniest issue that Islamist Nahda in this case, had to deal with after the revolution, is how do you manage the explosion of Salafism into public life after 2011, especially the jihadi groups that articulated the hegemonic vision of society, and politics. Islamists in particular were surprised, after 2011 revolution to discover that Salafism had become a social reality in the country, especially the most disaffected areas. And that Salafi jihadis, they have reaped the biggest gain, among Salafis from the political transition. And this was a unique situation in the Arab world. We haven't seen something like it. For the first time, we have jihadist ideologies and democratic experience, they intermingled together. And that aroused, passions and hopes and fears at the same time. For a brief moment, Tunisia became a theater to test the political and ideational impact of democratization on anti-systemic groups with jihadist ideological visions. So the chapter, examines the novelty of this case, and it provides insights into or on the factors that affected and mediated jihadist interactions with both the Islamists, Nahda in this case, led government, and also their interactions with other groups with opposing moral and ideological stances. So such an analysis of the intra-jihadi dynamics, the jihadi regime dynamics, the intergroup dynamics with other social and political actors, it helped to elucidate the choices that the jihadists adopted, especially Ansar Sharia, after 2011. And how those choices that Ansar Sharia has adopted were deeply affected by the internal contradictions of the movement itself and by the ambiguities of the jihadist movement themselves. I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Peter Mandeville to offer some thoughts.
Great, thanks, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this. I feel like an imposter because you moved me off the stage. Otherwise have a collection of this city's finest expertise on North Africa. Particularly go out and we bring Bill Lawrence's Algeria chops in, and so I kind of all respect. I really want to address two aspects of this very fine book that Fred and Anwar cover in the text itself, and that Fred in particular has already touched on in his remarks. First of all, I think the book is valuable just because the more contextualized analysis of Salafism that we have, the better. Just because Salafism tends to be talked about and regarded and treated as this fairly static, monolithic thing. Its own claims of universality religiously often not being interrogated by those who observe and analyze it. And so the more we have texts that look at the morphology, the evolution, the sort of Salafism as a lived religion in specific countries, regions, and contexts, the better. And I think the book does this very nicely. For those of you who have always been looking for a kind of very straightforward, concise, accessible, and yet detailed primer on just what Salafism is, the book's first chapter does that very nicely. So that first chapter alone, I think, is worth the price of buying a copy in the room after our bag in the back of the room later.
For the plug.
Sure. You can plug my book whenever. Which you know, what I really found valuable also is that often the presence of Salafism in a given region and context, Fred, as you mentioned, is regarded as evidence of Saudi or Gulf transnational influence, right? If you find Salafism somewhere, that means that Khalijis have been present and throwing money around. And this is a piece of mythology that needs to be dealt with, and I think you do so very nicely. I'm right now working on a book that looks at the history and contemporary forms of Saudi religious propagation, the sort of Saudi export of Wahhabism, and I'm happy to say that many of the preliminary findings that have come out of the research that I've done align very nicely with the basic points that you're making about the ways in which Salafism naturally takes on characteristics and varies in many ways in its expression, beliefs, and practices, depending on the specifics of local context. It's never a straightforward equation, I think, of the presence of Saudi influence or its lack. It is absolutely the case that in many countries, Salafism is present, and there has and continue to be often cross-fertilization with various Saudi transnational connections, which is sort of natural that those exist. But it's never impossible, I think, to simply reduce the presence of Salafism to those Saudi influences. And indeed, the nature of the relationship, directions of causality, if you want to think of it that way, are often much more complex. And this idea, and then one thing that's certainly coming through in the work that I'm doing is that this idea that often seems to circulate around Saudi global Wahhabi export about something like a sort of Wahhabism command and control center somewhere in Riyadh or in the Nejd, where a bunch of senior clerics sort of sit around and figure out which country to target next in their export activity. That just doesn't exist. If there's one thing we need to do, we need to sort of open up the black box of the terminology of Saudi funding for religion in country X, Y, or Z. And we often lapse fairly easily. I mean, how often do we read something that kind of talks about Saudi funding for Islam in Indonesia or Kyrgyzstan or wherever? And I think that often transmits this idea that there is this fairly unified Saudi strategy around this. But once you sort of open up that black box and come to understand the enormity and the diversity of the institutional apparatus, the organizations, the kind of entities that are involved in Saudi global da'wah activity, you find very quickly that you have a wide range of, official Saudi governmental ministries and agencies, but you also have parastatal organizations like the Muslim World League and the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, which are not Saudi government entities, but are funded by and strategically steered by the Saudis. You have any number of private Islamic charities in the kingdom, many of which were subject to much heavier regulation after 9/11, but a good number of which continue to enjoy varying levels of royal patronage that allow them to operate with some measure of impunity. You have institutions like the Islamic University of Medina. And one thing that's coming through very clearly in the work that I'm doing is that quite often these various Saudi entities are competing with each other for influence in other countries, meaning that what we see in other countries is often manifestations of domestic Saudi rivalries as different groups within the kingdom, often with varying interests in countries X, Y, or Z, vie for influence with each other. And I think this is an interesting way to think of the phenomenon of madkhalism in Libya that you've talked about, right? Where, again, just the use of that term, right, deriving very directly from a prominent Saudi scholarly family, seems to sort of be yet another manifestation of this, transplantation of Saudi Islam, when in fact, madkhalism has its own local Libyan logic that is shaped very much by the political environment that's currently present in that country. And even though Madkhali himself in Saudi Arabia has been something of the poster boy for loyalist Salafism in the kingdom, that's not exactly a useful framework for understanding what Madkhalism in Libya in the early 2020 means and looks like. So these processes of local mediation and local adaptation, I think, are very, very important. And I think, insofar as we're talking about transnational religious influence, it's worthwhile, recognizing that within North Africa itself, I think we have some of the most important religious counterbalances to Saudi influence. I think most, those that have worked most effectively have been efforts that focus very much on trying to balance Saudi influence in North Africa and its near abroad itself. I think particularly of Morocco, and we look at the work of people like Anne Wainscott and Sarah Alawi, who have written about the ways in which the history and legacies of Moroccan Sufi and Murid networks have allowed Morocco to have and to continue to enjoy a very prominent influence in sort of shaping elements and aspects of religious discourse and practice, not only in Morocco and Arabic-speaking North Africa, but also as we get into the Sahel as well, where some of those same tariqat and Sufi brotherhood networks are present and relevant. And of course, going back, Fred, to Libya itself, we have to think, of course, of the influence of the Libyan World Call Society, which under Gaddafi spent a lot of money engaging in activities that sort of did have the effect of, in certain countries and places you would be kind of surprised to learn, I think, of counterbalancing Saudi influences. Places like the United Kingdom, where the Muslim College of London, which was the first entity that sought to kind of create a contextualized approach to Islam, sort of that would reflect the specificity of the British Muslim experience. All of the funding for that came from Libya, and I think was understood by the Libyans as a way to compete with efforts on the part of Gulf countries to build influence. So there's a geopolitical logic to this that transcends the region itself. The second thing that I wanted to touch on briefly, that you also touch on in the book, is this idea of the deployment of Salafism and Salafi scholars as a countering violent extremism tool or tactic. It's interesting when you think about this, I think, in the history of the evolution of counterterrorism and CVE policy after 9/11, because after a period of time where the emphasis was primarily in Washington discourse on promoting moderate Islam, right? It was we want to find the progressive, liberal, moderates, Muslim voices to kind of amplify and deploy against the Salafis and the conservatives. I think best embodied by that now notorious 2006-2007 RAND study, Building Moderate Muslim Networks, that sort of had this image of Sufis as these sort of cuddly, huggy, lovey, peaceful Muslims. And if you just unleash the Sufis, then somehow Salafi jihadism will be defeated and go away, which just is a ridiculously ahistorical way to think about Sufism, which has been directly tied up in some of the most well-known insurgent and militant movements in modern Islamic history. Not to speak of various contexts in South Asia today, where Sufi groups are very heavily involved in sort of mobilizing violence at the intercommunal level. There was, from the mid-2000s then, I think, as we get into the later aughts, this idea that no, actually maybe it's the conservatives we need to focus on, because their voices will be seen as more legitimate. And some of this was, of course, tied up with phenomenon like the sort of supposed recantation documents issued by the former leadership of groups like Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya in Egypt, right? groups that were sort of, the forebears of contemporary Salafi jihadism now deciding that they were wrong, and so writing documents, not coincidentally from prison, that kind of talked about how wrong they were, that then the governments in question sought to circulate. I think in the hope that people drawn to these movements would read these documents and say, okay, no, this is not the way to go. All of these approaches, though, both the, let's deploy the Salafis and let's deploy the Sufis, I think suffer from some version of the same problem, which is, to my taste, I think putting too much emphasis on religion or religious ideas as the primary drivers of violent extremism. There's an opposite problem, which is to just sort of ignore religion altogether, to sort of see religion as wholly epiphenomenal and could claim that it has nothing to do. And I think that's a problematic approach as well. When it comes to CT and CVE, to my mind, there's some really important international partnership work with countries in the Middle East, the most valuable of which generally I think we don't see. It's intelligence sharing, it's certain kinds of technical cooperation, a lot of it is legal work, certain kinds of démarches and diplomatic requests, but there's also a lot of sort of theater of CT and CVE, performative stuff that goes on. And some of these are things like the various rehabilitation programs, right, where the Saudis are very keen to take international visitors and show them their amazing rehabilitation programs, where 87.8% of all people who have gone through these programs have become, peace-loving, loyal citizens of the state again, having been retrained and reprogrammed by a Wahhabi scholar who has put them on the straight path again. And coincidentally, they've been given wives and cars and houses and jobs as part of the package as well. And there are other sort of programs. Algeria has one, Kazakhstan has one, that are sort of held up as these. So this is part of the theater. Another part of the theater, I think, is this spate of summits and conferences that we've seen in places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Doha in recent years that are kind of, and in Marrakesh as well. You may all remember the Marrakesh Declaration, the Forum for Peace in Muslim Societies. At every moment we seem to be planning for the next great Gulf-based conference or summit on peace, tolerance, and coexistence. And you have this sort of frequent flyer class of interfaith religious scholars that kind of meet at these beautiful hotels, have these conferences, and then issue these statements, about how, people need to respect each other's differences, and we need to respect the rights of minorities. And there's some value in that, right? I'd rather they be saying that than saying, no, we should kill the minorities, right? But the problem, I think, is that in validating and embracing this kind of parade of tolerance symmetry, this sort of declaration culture, I think we run the risk of helping a lot of these governments to sustain a smokescreen that allows them to displace onto religion blame for problems whose more proximate causes lie within their own conduct in the region with respect to security, dynamics, stability, conflict, quality of good governance, those kinds of issues. So it's not just a sort of analytical problem around placing too much emphasis on religion. I think placing too much emphasis on religion is worryingly depoliticizing in that it forces us to take our eyes off the real source of the problem and lead us to maybe not push and apply the right kind of pressure when it comes to questions of policy in the region. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for really the opportunity to get to read this book before it got published. It, as Peter has mentioned, it really is a tour de force of looking into these 5 countries, really a deep dive into these 5 countries on the origins and the evolution of Salafism there. There are 2 things that I think the book does really well. The first is that it brings in the history of Salafism. Most of the literature on Salafism tends to be about Salafi jihadis, and so it starts with, a cursory throw out to Ibn Taymiyyah and then Wahhabism, and then a straight line to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so what this book does really well is to bring in everything in between, right? And what I found especially fascinating was the origins of Salafism under colonialism and the role that Salafism played in the resistance to colonialism, especially in Morocco and Algeria. I thought that was really fascinating and important to sort of connect the dots about connecting Wahhabism to the Salafis that we see today. So that's the first part. The second thing that the book, I think, does really well is that there's a tendency to think of Salafis in part because ideologically that's sort of their defining feature is their ideology. It's very extreme, literalist, and so the temptation is to think that their actions and their behavior stem from that ideology and that doctrine. But what the book does really well is to show that actually the behavior of Salafis, are they quietist, are they jihadist, are they political, that is much more determined by their local context, the incentives and opportunities that are in their local environment, as opposed to their doctrine or their literalist interpretation of the Quran or even any fatwas that are given by Saudi clerics. And so I think the book does a very good job on that point as well. And just one anecdote that stuck with me from the Libya chapter was where the Madkhali Salafis go to Saudi Arabia and try to change the fatwa from Madkhali to allow for a move from quietism to fighting for Haftar. So I thought that was very useful of an anecdote to show sort of the autonomy that the Madkhali Salafis have and sort of how they're shaped by their local environment and the incentives there as opposed to by fatwas or doctrines from abroad. And I want to sort of kick off the discussion with two questions, if I may, which was one takeaway from the book is that the quietist Salafists are far more important than we normally think they are. We kind of think of them as regime lackeys and therefore lacking in any popularity or legitimacy. But one takeaway I had from all of the chapters is that the quietist Salafis are actually fairly popular in their own right, which sort of gives them the ability when the opportunity arises to get into politics or into violence in a way that maybe we wouldn't have expected since we kind of view quietist Salafis as far less important than their jihadists or political party counterparts. And so what I'm curious about is why are the quietist Salafis so popular, especially since the grievances that the book sort of cites as explaining why Salafism is popular tends to be grievances about the status quo, frustration with the economy, frustration with the government. Why then are these somewhat status quo actors somewhat popular when the worldview they're advocating is one that is more status quo than these grievances that are looking for something new? And the second sort of discussion question I would have is, what do you see as the future of Salafism? I mean, especially now in Tunisia, where Salafi parties performed somewhat well in these recent elections, and you have the Karama coalition, you have Hizb Rahma now represented in the parliament. Where do you see these new Salafi political parties going in Tunisia? And also in Algeria, now that you have this opening, do you see the quietist Salafis capitalizing in some way politically on the potential opening in Algeria as well? I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you. I will allow you guys the chance to answer that question, but I want to build on that as well. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, based on what you were saying, that a lot of the growth in Salafism is due to the inability of the state to meet the people's demands, which is something that I think we are seeing more and more of, not less of. Do you expect to see a bigger political role, particularly for the quietists? Are we going to see more of what we're seeing in Tunisia, where Salafis are becoming part of the actually entrenched political system? And also, sort of the broader question about that is, are the governments aware of the growing trend of quietists, or the growing movements, and how are they responding? What is sort of the government reaction to this? Is this something where they just sort of accept it, or do they feel like there needs to be a pushback, recognizing there's probably a different answer for each of these countries? Fred, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. So our quietists, again, they're why are they becoming popular in Libya? What explains their growth? Again, I think it's partly due to this sense of disenchantment with the aftermath of the revolution, and these quietists, during the revolution, many of them did in fact stay loyal to Gaddafi. They sat at home. They sort of were on the sidelines. They did not participate. Some did, and were later, criticized by their peers. So there was obviously a fracturing. But what you've seen, and I've talked to many of them. I've talked to people that have joined Marxism after the after the revolution, is this sense of triumphalism. We were right. Look at what has happened. After the revolution, it was wrong to go against the Wali al-Amr. And so there's this sense of this narrative that and it's part of a broader nostalgia for the old order in Libya, or just a pure desire for security. And I think the Markhalis, and I agree, the term is actually quite problematic. It's interesting, you actually didn't find the term Markhalism being used in Libya until you had this sort of schism with more activist Islamist currents, some with the Brotherhood, and they were the ones that started using the term in their media. The term is problematic. I use it because it is somewhat accurate, but you're absolutely right. They don't just follow Markhali himself. They follow a whole range of clerics, and it's a point very well taken. But again, this group, the Markhalis, they basically they're setting up schools where other schools have failed. So they're offering services. They have this narrative of anti-vice. Libya is awash in drugs, guns. These are the guys that are going in. They're positioning themselves as the crime fighters, right? We're the SWAT team going in. We're going after drugs, prostitutes. And so they enjoy a certain credibility, at least an image of non-corruption. The police are non-existent, corrupt. The Markhalis are the ones that are cleaning up the streets. They run these prisons that they're no kidding hardcore jihadists inside these prisons, where they apply the same sort of Saudi rehabilitation principles. They give them bin Baz's pamphlets, say look, you've been cured. But they've also got in teenagers that have drug problems, and so the local people say, oh, I'll take my kid to the Markhali camp, and they'll sort him out. So this social service, I think, is that they're providing. And what's the bottom line here? The state's non-existent. There's no state. Right? So any group that comes in is going to have some credibility. But there's limits to that. There's profound unease, disenchantment, and fierce opposition to the Markhalis, opposition to certain Sufi traditions, the Prophet's birthday. These are sacred traditions that Libyans hold that date back, centuries, and the Markhali assault on them is seen as something foreign. So again, it's a negotiation. It's not that Markhalism is displacing something that's authentic. There is a sometimes violent renegotiation of the religious field in Libya, and the quietists do have a powerful card there, and I think it's partly this nostalgia that's going on.
Where in Tunisia, where do we see the future of Salafism? If you look at the quietist Salafism, out of the ashes of Ansar Sharia, this jihadist movement, because remember, after the revolution, the most dominant strain of Salafism in Tunisia was the jihadist variant. The quietist Salafists, or the political Salafists, did not do well. They participated in politics, but they did not, secure any participation. So the most vibrant was the jihadists. Once the movement obviously was lost militarily by 2014, because Ansar Sharia, ended 2014, what happened is that out of the ashes of this movement, there are some signs that a more conciliatory strain of Salafism is trying to carve a place for itself, in the public arena of contestation. So what we have seen is that, Salafists are creating associations to try to defend, Salafists that have been, in their view, illegally, persecuted or imprisoned, because after 2013, 2014, the state has adopted the repressive stance, right, towards Salafists. So whether you are quietists or jihadists, it did not matter much. So after 2014, 15, and now they have grouped in these associations in which they try to adopt a more legalistic approach, right, towards challenging what they see as the state's excesses. So they have forsworn violence, and they have tried to challenge the state, in one aspect in this legal domain. Others is that they have created, more charities, right? Trying to proselytize, trying to demonstrate that they are, subscribers to this peaceful activist strain. So that's healthy in some regard, because the approach that the state has adopted, there have been legitimate questions about it. You cannot just repress all Salafists, right? Even if you don't like the quietist Salafists and their doctrine, you can't lump them all together with the jihadists, right? And there is a small strain that still, believe that the best approach is to participate in politics, since there is a democratic experiment, right? And there is an opening out there, and there have been, some credence to this thesis. So it would be, worthwhile to see whether that success can appeal, to large swaths of those that subscribe to Ansar Sharia. Remember, tens of thousands of Tunisians, they bought into Ansar Sharia's views in 2011 and 12 and 13. Those basically are disenchanted with the democratic transition, right? They say the democratic transition has been captured by these old elites, whether it's political Islamists or secularists. I mean, nothing has been done on the economic front, on the social front. Nothing basically has changed, right? In their view. In Algeria, it's interesting, case again to see the transition. But so far, most of the quietists, they have called for people to participate in the election. Not Salafists, but they asked the Algerians to go and vote. Why they asked them to go and vote? As a show of support for the military. Because you have to read them in the eulogies about Qaid Saleh and others. They have portrayed Qaid Saleh as this, heroic nationalist, who saved Algeria from, a down spiral towards violence, right? So, but most quietist Salafists for now, they still oppose political participation, right? Those that subscribe to politics have not done well, right? They have not done well. But again, it's a country in transition. It's worth to see. Morocco is quite interesting. As I said, there was a division within the quietist current after the coup in Egypt. There is one current that believes that the best path is through politics, and that's Hamad al-Qabbaj. He still debates quietist Salafists, and he argues that, democracy is not opposed to Islam, and if you want to change the system, you just change it from inside. I mean, if you want to proselytize, you can do it from inside, right? So, and in any case, the monarchy is the major player. It's the dominant player. It is still the strongest player. So it's just foolish, obviously, to challenge it, otherwise. So that's in Morocco. This reformist current is interesting to watch.
Great. I'd like to open it up to all of you. Okay, Bill. And there, please wait for a microphone. Should be coming up front here. Cindy. Up here.
Thanks for the shout out, Peter. I don't have a book to plug, but I'll give you a call when, when I do. And kudos to Carnegie, because not only do you consistently do really interesting events on the Maghreb, but you edifying events on the Maghreb, and you take it to another level. So I really appreciate the collective effort here. As Anwar was just talking at the end, I started to think about the litmus test questions I have for which categories Salafi groups, and for the non-jihad, or in general, it's often like, what are you trying to change? And then the answer is what category you're falling in and how you're trying to change it. And for the jihadis, what's a legitimate target? And I'm surprised you didn't get into that, because the biggest debates underlying so many of the debates for Salafi jihadis is who's a legitimate target. And they'll often killing each other over who's legitimate to kill. And so I find that a useful frame. I also, as you were talking, I was thinking about the term quietist. It's always bothered me, and I don't use it because I just started thinking of the Salafi protests at the end of my street in Agdal when I was living there outside the prison ministry. Those were anything but quietist, rhetorically, volume level, and everything else. And so I think the term quietist is conceals more than it reveals. And I also applaud, but also encourage all of you to go even further in the blurring of the lines, because I don't know if any of you took a glance at Chaim Malka's and my piece on the new Salafi jihadism at CSIS in 2013, but a lot of these categories, while they're useful at the beginning of a conversation, quickly end up devolving into uselessness for all the reasons you guys have given examples of. And so we can drop these groups temporarily in a bucket, but then quickly we have to look at all the hybridization, which gets me to my two questions. For Fred, I was wondering if you could just take a glance at what just happened in Sirt. Mary, when she got back from a recent trip, Mary Fitzgerald said that the real action in Libya is not on the front lines, it's the back channel negotiations. And suddenly we saw that the West supporting Madkhalis in the 604th Brigade shifted sides either before or in the middle of the Sirt battle and joined Haftar's group. And I was wondering, in the context of this discussion, right, and everything you guys said about localized Madkhalism and Madkhalism not being a unified thing, what just happened in Sirt prove, I guess, about the point you're making? Like, how do you read the fact that the Madkhalis that had defeated ISIS just joined Haftar, who didn't fight ISIS much? And my question for Anwar is about our favorite group, and you and I were at the day they announced the new leader of Adl Ihsan outside of Rabat there, in Saleh, because they're another weird blurring, right? They're Sufi roots, they're a brotherhood, but they're kind of Salafist. And to sort of lead you towards the answer, my specialty in terms of research is youth political culture. And getting back to an early point Fred made, I'm as interested in what Salafis absorb from the general culture as what the general culture absorbs from Salafis. And there are tons of Salafi ideas in general political culture now. Just look at the rap music. It's an easy one. And you'll find all the Salafism in there now by people who won't even profess to be Salafis. So we have lots of blurring, I'm talking about here, blurring of the lines. And I guess, in that complex mix, we find the Maghreb.
Let's take one more question and then we'll. Sorry, up front here. Sorry, Sandy, to make you turn around again. If you could just wait for the microphone, just 1 second. Thank you.
I think Salafism started when Saudi Arabia became more economically powerful. And so there are schools and universities, students, they get free education, they go to Saudi Arabia, and then that's how the Salafism, as you know, from the 80s, start to become well known. And you have students from Libya, from all over the world. They go to Saudi Arabia, and that's how they become. We didn't know before Salafism. It's only after when students went to Saudi Arabia. So I think that's one point. I think maybe we can discuss if you can. The second point is, I think the Salafism, when they went to Saudi Arabia, and then became Afghanistan, and became sort of two divisions, jihadist Salafist and quiet Salafist. And I think that's how, even jihadists, I think they have root as a Salafist, but then became, when they engaged with the war in Afghanistan, then become jihadist. So I think these two things, 2 points, maybe you can address.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So on the 604th, this is an interesting sort of test study. I interviewed the commanders of the 604th in Sirt in 2017, and again, their Salafi ideology was just one facet of their composition. They're from the Firjan tribe, right, which is the same tribe as Haftar, and so they were always in somewhat of a balancing act because they received help from the GNA forces. They received help from the Misratans against the Islamic State. Again, the Islamic State, massacred these Firjan in this particular neighborhood. That was the nucleus for the 604. So the Madkhali ideology sat on top of this tribal ideology, and Sirte is right on the fault line. So what determined whether they're going to go which way or which? Was it ideology? No, it was basically them testing, I think, the winds and seeing Haftar come up. There was definitely back channel stuff humming going on, something went on. But the commanders of the 604 told me in 2017, again, this was a completely different time. They said, look, if Haftar comes to Sirte with his Salafis, with his Madkhalis, we're going to tell them, don't come here. This is a harb, siyasiyya. That what you did in Benghazi was against the Khawarij. That was legitimate. But if you come here, you're bringing politics. We don't want you here. So they were rationalizing legitimacy in terms of religious legitimacy. But now the situation's changed. I mean, Haftar's moving in. Something happened. The Misratans are crying betrayal. We helped you against ISIS, and now you're siding with. So what does this tell us? I mean, these guys are rational, political, calculating actors. Same kind of rhetoric goes on with the GNA about who's the Wali al-Amr. Well, it's the one that allows you to go to the Hajj. It's not the one that's, I mean, I could splice it intellectually 1,000 times the way they rationalize this. Again, interpreting the fatwa to their local political circumstances. And it's obviously politically and militarily, it's a huge coup for Haftar to be now here in Sirte. Sure, if he comes up to the gates of Tripoli, there are going to be groups, not just Madkhalis, but other groups that probably, some of them will come to his side, others will not. I mean, I think it's overrated how much will. Between who? There was probably an East. No, the Madkhalis I talked to in Sirte, they knew they were already talking to the ones in the East. The two, yeah. So there were those channels there, and so again, networks of facilitation, not a broad conspiracy, but when power shifts, they're going to, is that okay?
All right, yeah. For Adl wal-Ihsan, Adl wal-Ihsan was a favorite target of most Salafists. I mean, until somewhere in 2012, 2013, when if we take the quietist Salafists, when the movement bifurcated, they criticized Adl wal-Ihsan basically because it's a mixture of Islamism and Sufism, and they attacked obviously the former leader for some of the statements he made and some of the visions he had, and so they savaged the ideology of Adl wal-Ihsan. I mean, since at least the 1980s and 1990s. And True, in some regard, right? But when the movements divided or split, that reformist current, in fact, Al-Qabbaj has been one of the most defenders of Adl wal-Ihsan. He criticizes, Salafists. He says it's irresponsible, to take on, a movement that really wants, the good for the country. Yes, we may disagree theologically. Some of them are Sufis, some believe in going and visiting saints, and obviously that runs counter to what Salafis believe. But Al-Qabbaj said, you have to focus on what you want to accomplish, right? Because what some of the quietist Salafis did after the coup in Egypt is that, they had a complete turnaround. They support, obviously, the monarchy, and by implication, the Saudis and the Emiratis, and they blessed the coup, right? And some of them, even if they say you shouldn't participate in politics, they have asked their followers to vote for parties that are close to the palace. So that enraged, Al-Qabbaj. He said, it's irresponsible to tell people to vote for PAM. The PAM was at the time led by what he described as a Marxist, authoritarian, secularists. So he said it just doesn't make any sense. He said, in fact, Adl wal-Ihsan, and Sheikh Yassin, we may disagree, but they said he's a respected nationalist and he's a respected Islamist scholar. So even if we disagree, we can't go online and just keep savaging him, because that's exactly what has been done. So now there is a tug of war within quietist Salafists and then with the Madkhalists as well, right? So that's the Moroccan case. For the Saudis, obviously, are more of an expert But quickly, yes, I mean, they had an influence, I mean, in the 70s and 80s. I mean, al-Maghrawi, obviously, you know, in Morocco and Algeria, Firkus and others. I mean, these are all, you know, products of Saudi Arabia. They went to school there and elsewhere. But nonetheless, I mean, the local contexts matter. Because al-Maghrawi in 2011, you know, he is a protege of the Saudis. In 2011, when he saw, you know, the protests, you know, he said, I sympathize with the February movement. And people are like, wow, okay. He was very careful not to criticize the monarchy, because these are pragmatic, strategic actors after all. He knows that the monarchy still has support, and it's still, you know, stable. But nonetheless, he said, I sympathize, you know, with the movements, and I hope that the monarch, you know, is responsive. And he did that strategically, and they even asked his followers to vote for the PGD, the Islamists, you know, for logical reasons, because the Islamists, they stood with the Salafists after 2003, the terrorist attack in which the regime, you know, clumped down on most Salafists. So yes, the Saudis still play a role. In Algeria, and I'll stop here, remember there is within the quietist Salafists, there is, you know, a debate of who to follow, whether it's Rabi' al-Madkhali or it's Muhammad al-Madkhali, right? And they're still at it online. I mean, they are just, wow, when you read, you know, the attacks that they trade at each other, I mean, some are really, you know, nasty, mean, right? So yeah, the Saudis are still there, but as, you know, Peter said, there are intra, you know, Saudi competition as well. I don't know whether.
Well, I mean, I would also say that there are Salafi groups that existed before the current Saudi state even consolidated. So as Stéphane Lacroix's work on Egypt has shown, in the 1920s, you had Saudi religious scholars engaging with religious groups and scholars in Egypt who, in terms of aqidah and fiqh, are absolutely, yes, absolutely. And in South Asia and Pakistan, you have the Ahl Hadith. They don't call themselves a Salafiyya, but again, in terms of aqidah and fiqh, they're anti-madhab. They are effectively Salafi. And there's certainly cross-fertilization with the Saudis, but you can't say that they exist because of Saudi Arabia. Also, there's enormous upsurge of interest in Salafism by young people, young Muslims around the world today. Some people see this as evidence of Saudi influence. I think there's a separate sociology around religious knowledge consumption that is separate from Saudi influence that explains this, which is young people seeking information about Islam online, on the internet, that find 8,000 answers to every question they ask. Fatwa, 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 kida, kida, kida. It's all correct. It all cites hadith and the Prophet. It all looks legitimate, and they don't know what to believe. I think part of the appeal of Salafism today is that it's able to represent itself as more authentic, right? And so young people are drawn to that because it absolves them of the need of having to figure out which of these 6 million interpretations of Islam is correct. And so I think there's a certain aesthetic appeal to the way that Salafism represents itself that has nothing to do with the influence of Saudi Arabia today.
I mean, it was local. It was local. Egypt was, Salafism around the world was local rather than exported. And
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Munji?
Thank you. Munji Dawali from the Libyan American Alliance. Just I'm interested in and I didn't read the book, but I'm looking forward to it. If you looked into the influence of Salafism within some of the Islamic movements, whether it's in Nahda or others in the Maghreb. I mean, I remember back in the Congress of Nahda, the 9th one, the one that took place in 2012, I attended the Congress, and within the Congress itself, there were, if you can call them Nahdawi Salafists, who were trying to influence the outcome of some of the decisions were made within that Congress by passing leaflets that talks about Sharia and how we need to advance it within the current situation in Tunis. I mean, it was defeated eventually, but that kind of influence that I'm looking into is within these Islamic movements.
One more, yeah.
Hi, my name is Charles Debo. I'm a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute. I've actually, I think, a similar question, which is, what is your reading of this dynamic between the Ikhwani movement, like the Muslim Brotherhood and affiliates, and these different branches of Salafism? As it was mentioned, there are many examples where there is a link and you have Salafi branches in Ikhwani parties. And we've seen in Egypt, for instance, how Salafi, political Salafis can go against the Ikhwani. I mean, we've seen different political confrontations, and the alliances can go in all directions, basically, depending on the context. But my question refers more to the ideology and the political principles that each branch or each trend is trying to develop. How do you see this evolving, and basically, do you see clear ideological lines developing, allowing, for instance, more alliances between Salafis and Ikhwanis, or do you think that the trend is more and more divisions between these actors in the different scenes? Because I guess from the outside, it looks sometimes very messy, and there's a lot of nuances that you have to be familiar with to understand the logic. But are there like some key elements you've highlighted in the book that can help making these differences?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the alliances, I mean, context matters, you know. And there have been alliances. I mean, to go back to the Moroccan case, right? After 2011, I mean, the most of quietist Salafists, al-Maghrawi himself, right? Before he had his turnaround in 2014, because the geopolitical, you know, context has changed. He turned against, you know, democratizations and elsewhere. I mean, he asked his followers, I mean, to vote for the PGD, which they did. And we have evidence that they did, because they swept in Marrakesh and other hubs where Salafis are known, right, to have a base in there. So this is in the record. There was an alliance, tactical alliance there, right, between the quietist Salafis. That tactical alliance fractured after the coup in Egypt in 2013, because the regime in Morocco, after the Salafists, quietists voted for the PGD, what they did is that they went and closed their schools and they cracked down on the movement. Right? So in 2013, there was the strategic calculus. Does it make sense to stay in alliance with the PGD, right? And how powerless it is to stop the closing of our schools and mosques. The PGD couldn't do much 2013 and 2014, or we do a turnaround. So there was again a fracture between the PGD and quietist Salafists. The reformist Al-Qabbaj, you know, he said that we need to keep that alliance, and in fact, he wanted to participate in the elections under the PGD banner, which he did, but the Interior Ministry banned him. You know, the regime is still not yet ready to allow, you know, the quietist, in this case, the reformists, even if they are pro-monarchy, to participate in politics. Tunisia is also an interesting case. I mean, remember, there are divisions which, you know, pass within this. You know, when Salafism, you know, exploded in 2011, there were three schools within Nahda of what to do with these guys, right? I mean, the Ghanouchi one, he said, look, we need to engage them, right? We cannot just replicate the Ben Ali method and crack down. We will end up radicalizing these guys. So, you know, this is just a moment of fervor, you know, and after their pent-up frustration is let out, they will, like what we did in the 70s, they will realize that ideological excess does not take you, you know, anywhere. So probably they will become like us. There was a second school that said, look, I mean, these, you know, they can be our allies ideologically, right? And in fact, we need to co-opt this movement. If we can get them to vote for us, and we share some ideological, you know, similarities with them, then why not? So this school supported, you know, electoral and doctrinal alliances between Islamists and Salafists. And Sadok Shuro, obviously, is, you know, he was the most representative, right, of this trend. The third trend that said, look, I mean, we should just stay away from Salafists. They would just take us into trouble, right? And that's the former Prime Minister Araid. So, but there is potential there for alliances between Islamists and Salafists. Morocco is a good case in point. Tunisia, was also somewhat a case in point. Algeria is still different. The quietists, they believe that the army is still in charge, so it's a wait and see. And the Islamists, anyway, they have lost much of their elan. The Islamists in Algeria, you can't compare them with PGD or Nahda. I mean, these are much more mature intellectually and politically than their counterparts in Algeria.
There are examples in Mauritania of coalitions and sort of barriers being breached between the Salafis and the Ikhwan. I mean, I was just thinking recently to some statements by Abu Hafs al-Mauritani, who was a well-known former Al-Qaeda ideologue. He was actually critiquing a decision by the Mauritanian government to allow the visit of a sheikh from Al-Azhar. And you had him, basically, the statement he made matched almost exactly something that was issued by the Brotherhood affiliate in Mauritania. And so it was an interesting convergence of alignments there, of interests. And there's been history of this in Mauritania, a small country, the Islamists, many of them, even the sort of Haraki or sort of activists, they all studied at this Saudi institute in the 70s. You have someone like Dadou, who's this very famous cleric who it's hard to call him a Salafi. He's sort of Sahwa, he's reached out to the Sufi. So my point again is sort of shape-shifting depending on the local context. The other end of the spectrum is Libya, where you've got intense political fragmentation, very vicious fighting. There's no coalitions ongoing right now. I mean, there's an intense struggle for religious institutions, for social space, a struggle over the Al-Qaf. I mean, the Brotherhood basically told me, like, look, we're at war with these Madkhalis. I mean, it's intense. It's mapped onto the broader political split between Haftar and the GNA. But again, I'm hard-pressed to find any example of any coalition building.
Offer Sharon and Peter a chance for any final comments before? No? Okay, well, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel, and thank you all for coming. And yes, go get your own copy back there. Yeah,
I guess that's good for an undergrad.
I wrote it, man. Be careful. I'm here. No, it was supposed to be brief. 7 points.
No, it's
I teach it.